You all know that Easter wasn't as sad as they all thought it was. It wasn't the end, but it felt like it was. We've been studying through the Gospel of Mark since the beginning of this year, trying to see what that gospel is. What was Mark trying to tell us? You see, the Gospels weren't written to give a historical account of Jesus and everything he said and did. That's not why they were written. They were written to convey a message, a purpose. Why did Jesus do what he did? Who was he? What was going on in the first century that changed the world? And if you've been with us for the whole study, I hope that you've come to understand that. If you haven't, I want to mention that we do have a YouTube channel now, and almost all of them from this year are up there. So you can go back and look at them. There's a few that we still have to get up, but we've been going every week going forward the last several weeks now. So you can't catch up on how we've been studying, but here we are on the last chapter, after the end. Chapter 15 in Mark is the end. Chapter 16 is the new beginning. Early Sunday morning, Mary Magdalene, Mary the mother of James, and Salome brought spices. They were coming to embalm the body of Christ. They weren't thinking clearly. They'd been living in a fog for 3 days. Jesus was dead. Hope was gone. He just let them kill him. Everyone had such high hopes, particularly coming into Jerusalem just 4, 5, 6, 7 days earlier. They were coming in triumphantly. They thought now was the time Jesus was going to branch out. He was going to start his real ministry. He spent 3 years going through the countryside, showing every Jewish person who he was and what he was doing. And now it was all about to begin. And at one of the most celebrated festivals of the Jewish calendar, when everyone was at their most excited, Jesus was taken, beaten, and killed, and he did nothing to stop it. There's not a single one of his followers that would have had any doubt that Jesus could have taken out any person that got in his way. And he let it happen. I put the music to this song. I didn't put the video together. It's on another. I put it in the bulletin. So there's a Christian song someone put to this video, and I changed it to this one because I wanted to not hear the joy of Easter. I didn't want to hear what we're supposed to do to imitate Christ at Easter. The nails in his hand. This man is the song that this video was originally put to. I wanted you to see the sadness, the sorrow, what was going through John's mind as he experienced all of this. Notice all of the other disciples ran in fear when they captured him, and they're huddled up in this upper room. John went with these women to the cross. He went with them and watched Jesus die. And all I can think of is John thinking, if only we could have him back. So they didn't have the Holy Spirit come. Not for another 50 days. Easter, as I said just before breakfast this morning, was not a joyous occasion. It was the end of everything that they knew. So these women are walking to the tomb just dazed, weeping. At least they're brave enough to go out in public. The disciples are hiding in the room, weeping and crying and thinking that their lives are over now because if they kill Jesus, they're certainly going to come after his followers. And maybe the women were braver because women didn't get attacked the same way men would. They were just following Jesus' ministry and providing comfort and aid and food and things like that. So they weren't really a part of his group. So they may not have feared as much for their own lives going out. Or, if you want to think of it the other way, they were incredibly brave. or just so lost and numb. They didn't care what happened to him. As they walked to the tomb with all of these embalming spices, and then finally on their way there it occurred to them, who's going to roll the stone away? We didn't even stop to think how we were going to accomplish what we're going to do. That's how lost they felt. But as they got there, looking up, they saw the stone had been rolled away. They entered the tomb and they were alarmed to see a young man in a white robe sitting there. And he says, "Don't be alarmed. You're looking for Jesus of Nazareth, right? He was crucified. He's risen. He's not here. See the place where they laid him? He's gone. But go and tell his disciples and Peter that he is going before you into Galilee, and there you will see him, just as he told you." And it says that they ran in fear and told no one. Why did this young man in a white robe single out Peter? Why did he say, "Go and tell his disciples," and make sure Peter's with them? If no one else hears this, and remember on that first week, Thomas didn't hear it. He wasn't there. It was another week before he comes and he sees Jesus appear, and Jesus says, "See my scars, it's really me." So he didn't say, "Wait until all of the 11 are gathered together and then tell them." He said, "Make sure Peter hears this today." Because there were two people of the disciples that were incredibly lost the night of his betrayal. And we saw that last week. There was Judas and there was Peter. Judas lost it. He lost it and he killed himself. I don't know that I would even say that Peter was that far from it. When Jesus said, "You're going to deny me 3 times," and Peter said, "I will die with you." And then it happened. And 3 times he denied, and then Jesus looked across the courtyard where they were beating him and stared right at Peter. Peter ran off. See, Peter was destined for great things. He was going to lead the early church. He was going to be one of the major voices in the expansion. And Paul would go to the Gentiles, and James would lead the church in Jerusalem, but Peter was the rock. That's why he called him that. And Jesus had been praying for Peter in the garden. We don't hear everything that Jesus was praying because we know they all fell asleep. But remember, Jesus said, "I have prayed for you." Because the spirit is willing, but the flesh is weak. And the first thing Jesus thought to tell this angel, this young man in a white robe, he said, "Make sure Peter knows that I'm okay. And that this was all part of the plan." That's how much God loves us. All the stuff he was going through, and he needs to single out one man who he knows is going to be taking this harder than anybody else. And he says, make sure he knows that it's not over. But Mark tells us that the women ran in fear. They didn't tell anybody. But then it goes on in another section, and here's a part, if you know any of your history of the Bible, there's brackets typically around this next verse to the end. And the reason there's brackets is because some of the translations will tell you that some of the earliest manuscripts don't contain this last part. Some of the earliest versions of the Gospel Mark that we have in existence don't have this little piece at the end. What they don't tell you is that it's like 2 or 3 of them that don't have it, and there's like 12 or 13 that do. It's not that this was added by Christians later. It was that there was 2 manuscripts they can't find this with. Now, does that mean that somebody wrote a copy of it and left this out? Perhaps. Does that mean that somebody wrote a copy and somebody grabbed the last page to make sure someone else got to read this and it never found its way back into the book? That's possible too. We can't say. All we know is that there's a couple of those first dozen that this doesn't appear in. And so if it was added later, it would have been added very quickly later when the believers started saying, what's going on? I mean, all this gospel, all this story of Jesus' ministry, his life and his death, and then his resurrection is like 15 verses, 13 verses, 12. All he said was, this guy in a white robe said, go and tell him to meet me. And that ended the gospel. So it's possible that the first couple of these manuscripts got up and that's all it said and people were begging for more. And said, what happened? So here's what's added. Mary Magdalene didn't run away with the other two women. She stayed right there in the garden. Because none of those three believed what this one young man had just told them. He's risen, going to Galilee. What are you talking about? Jesus is dead, and now he's gone. Where did they take him? They weren't thinking clearly. They didn't understand what was just spoken to them. The two women ran in terror, wondering if the Romans had moved the body and they're going to trap them all in Galilee, get all the disciples together to kill them, or whatever's going through their mind, and they just take off and they don't share that with anybody. But Mary Magdalene, whether it's because she had less fear, she had more love, or she was just more numb than the rest, she just stayed there. We don't see the words in Mark. And for most of this study, I wanted to just stick to Mark because what we're looking at is the very first witness to the gospel. The first gospel written. This was all that the Christians knew. All that non-Christians would be able to hear about what Jesus did. So I've been trying in this study to stay with just the Gospel of Mark so we don't add in all those other things we know about Jesus. We just want to see what Mark was trying to say. But I do want to add this one part as we close it. In the Gospel of John, he tells us what Mary did when she stayed there. She started looking around, just walking aimlessly around this garden tomb area, and she saw a garden. And she said, please, do you know where they took it? I won't give you any trouble. I just want to know where they took his body. And the gardener said, over there. And she broke down. Because while she didn't recognize him in the new body, she knew the way that Jesus always spoke to her. What Mark says is Mary Magdalene stayed in the garden, and she was the first to see the risen Christ. She clearly didn't understand correctly what the robed man had said, but then Jesus appeared to Mary, and she ran and told the disciples, it says, who were mourning and weeping. They didn't believe her. She was hysterical and said, Jesus is alive. I've seen him. And they thought she was out of her mind. Wouldn't you? She was distraught. You know why there's people saying that Mary was married to Jesus, why the Da Vinci Code talks about Mary Magdalene being his wife, about all this stuff, the secret gospels, the Gnostic writings from the 4th and 5th century that try to dilute our faith and say that all this other stuff was going on. It's because we know from the 1st century, Mary loved him a lot. And we know why. Because Jesus said, he who is forgiven much loves much. And Mary Magdalene was healed of 7 demons. And she worshipped the ground he walked on. So here's this woman just distraught. She's just not speaking clearly, and the disciples couldn't believe it. But then Mark tells us that Jesus also appeared to a couple that were walking out of the country. We know from Luke that they were the two on the road to Emmaus. And when they recognized that they were speaking with Jesus, they ran back to Jerusalem to tell the group. And they didn't believe them either. And then afterward, he appeared to the 11. Why didn't they believe Mary? Why didn't they believe the two? Why didn't they believe what Jesus had been trying to tell them for months? Remember after the great line of Peter where he says, "You're the Christ," Jesus started talking about his death. And that in 3 days he would raise from the dead. Why didn't they believe him? Why didn't they understand him? Well, because John watched him die. If you've never seen the Passion of the Christ, just that one scene will change you. And if you can't take gore, then just fast forward into that one scene, because while he's on the cross and he's bloody, it's not the worst of it. But you see John standing there with these women, crying. There's a reason why the Bible, why John in his own gospel refers to himself as the disciple Jesus loved. Because John, of all the men, had the guts to stand out there and stay by Jesus as he went through this. He watched him die. He heard him cry out in defeat. He said, "My God, why have you forsaken me?" He saw Jesus feeling abandoned by God. And the last thing he said before he died is, "It's over," right? It's finished. And we talked last week about 3 testimonies that took place on that day during his death. There was the testimony of Joseph of Arimathea, who saw something and heard something that was going on that convinced him and gave him the courage and the boldness to say, "I want to take his body and put him in my tomb." We saw the testimony of the Roman centurion who said, everything that was going on, surely this was the Son of God. But John did see a testimony. John was a fisherman. He didn't study the scriptures. He didn't know Jesus was talking Psalm 22. Not until later when the Spirit comes and fills them and they start to learn, and then they start to teach the rest of the believers and going out in Acts and saying, "This is what was fulfilled. This was fulfilled." John didn't know that. He watched the man die and cry out, and fear and grief was overwhelming him. My question to us this morning is the same. Why is it so hard for people today, even some of us in this room, to believe that Jesus actually came back from the dead? To believe that the resurrection is a historical fact? I'll tell you why. It's the same reasons. The times are different, but the reasons don't change. We know from experience that death is final. How many of us have lost a loved one? Raise your hand if you know someone close that has passed away. Did you see them again? It doesn't happen. And most of us in this room have faith and we believe Jesus. We know that the resurrection will happen on the last day and we'll be reunited with our loved ones. And we believe that sort of intellectually at least, and some of us even more faithfully. But at the surface level, people don't come back. So when Mary came running into the room to the disciples and said, "I've seen him," they can't believe that any more than you would. We also are faced with the religion of this world continually seeking to undermine our faith. What's that religion? Evolution. And again, I'm sure that there are some of us in this room that buy into that lie. Evolution was created to justify our existence without God. That's why it exists. Now, certainly some advances in science and technology have occurred because of that thought. The concept of evolution allows us to look down into the micro level, into the bacteria and germs and viruses. We can create cures for diseases. We can understand mutations by having this notion that that may be what it is. But that doesn't mean that that's true. There's a lot of good thought exercises that have led to developments and advances in our sciences that themselves are completely fabricated. It's a thought experiment. What happened is our world has taken that thought experiment and made it a fact. We evolved so that there is no need for God. That's why it exists. That's why Darwin proposed it. And Darwin has been completely debunked. No real scientist believes in the gradual evolutionary process. It can't happen. So we have this spontaneous, I forget what they call it. We have this Cambrian explosion. If you've studied anything about history and evolution and the science, is that they've come up with new ways that evolution could still be true, even though Darwin didn't have it right. And every time they come up with another theory, and it gets to the point where they can either test it and prove it right or prove it wrong, it's almost always proven wrong and have to change their theory. And that's fine, because that's what science is all about, is coming up with an idea, seeing if it's right, and if it's not, you come up with a different idea. There's nothing wrong with that. But God came up with an idea from 6,000 or 7,000 years ago, and that idea has never changed. There is truth out there, and it's not just what we can prove. There is nothing about the resurrection that makes sense to our scientific minds. It just doesn't make sense. But does that mean it didn't happen? We also have a hard time believing it because there is too much wrong in this world to hope. Bad things happen all the time. You know what? I've even found myself, I'm guilty of this as much as anybody. I have found myself wondering, am I believing to give me hope in the face of just meaninglessness? Or is God real? Is God real, or am I self-deluded? Am I trying to give myself encouragement, give myself hope? Am I looking to some stick give me some kind of hope? We're like, okay, no, my life isn't that bad, and even as bad as it gets, something good can happen because God promised that it would. And then people tell me, there is no God, you just are acting like that. It's a crutch. You're leaning on something that gives you some kind of hope, but what is it really? It's hard for us to believe this stuff because it doesn't happen, because the world tells us it can't happen, and because to our minds it doesn't make much sense. The fact is, there was a young man in a white robe in an empty tomb. It said, he's not here. He rose from the dead like he told you he would. And then he appeared to Mary, and then he appeared to two on the road, and then he appeared to the 10 disciples, and then the next week he appeared to Thomas, and then after that he appeared to upwards of 500 people over a period of 40 days, teaching them about why he had to go through what he went through, until they finally saw him with their own eyes float up into the sky and disappear. I can't prove that because it was 2,000 years ago and they didn't have video cameras. But I can prove that from the testimony of the world. I mean, you can get a mass of people to believe in a delusion. You can. But you can't get every one of them to go to their death for it and never break. Do you know how easy it is for cops to break a group of criminals that are caught? 5 or 6 or 7 people working together on some job. Someone always breaks. These men didn't break because they weren't lying. They saw what they said they saw. And they couldn't change their story to save their lives. That's what happened. know, Easter is a time to decide, are we going to believe what God says? Or are we going to believe what we can understand? I've been a Christian since I was 9 years old. I've been studying the Bible since college. I've been ministering. I've been a pastor for 11 years or so now. And I still don't understand it all. I could teach to all of you each Sunday what I know, what I've come to understand, the things that I've seen. I could teach you how to look for things yourselves, and you will discover things in the Bible that I have never seen. But I don't know it all. But you know where I start? And I started back in college when I started to study, when I came to the realization that if any religion on the planet was true, it had to be Christianity. And if you want to talk about this sometime, I would love to. Because I studied 10 or 12, 13 different religions. And I tried to understand them, and I tried to go through them and find their evidence, and find their claims and their proof. And Christianity is the only one that holds up. And so if nothing is right, we're all deluded. But if anything is right, it was the Bible. And that's what I staked my life on. And on Easter, I remind myself, and I remind all of you, that Jesus said, "Follow me." He prayed for us that where He's going, we would be also. And that even though you don't see people coming back from the dead in this life, we know that it's happened. We know that Jesus was the first fruit and that He's going to come back. It says afterwards, He appeared to the 11 themselves as they were reclining at the table, and He rebuked them for their unbelief and hardness of heart, because they had not believed those who saw Him after He was risen. You know, doubting Thomas gets a really bad rap. Not a single one of the disciples believed it until they saw it. But Jesus said, "Blessed are those who believe but don't see." And that's all of you. You have the potential for greater faith than any of the disciples ever had. Did you realize that? Those disciples that cured the sick, raised the dead, spread the gospel into almost all of the known world at the time, gave their lives for that gospel. Every one of us in this room has the potential for greater than anything they did. Because we have a special blessing on us if we believe it, even though we weren't there to witness it ourselves firsthand. And He said to them, "Go into all the world and proclaim the gospel to the whole creation." Mark made it very clear in his gospel that there was a turning point in history. The Son of God came to live among us, to lead us, to teach us, and to sacrifice His life for us. The world tries every day to go back to the time before that revelation. But we can't go back. That's why Christians are hated or feared or persecuted so much around the world. Because this world doesn't want to know that Jesus came. They don't want to know that there's accountability for our actions, that there's a punishment for our sin. So many wish we could just go back and unknow what we've been given and live like we did before. Might makes right, the strong wins. There's no reason to be good to each other without Jesus, without God, without responsibility, accountability. But we can't go back. It's one of my favorite aspects of the movie trilogy, The Matrix. Being shown the real world. You can't go back now. Now that you know what reality is, you can't forget that you know that. But the question was posed, if you could, would you?